Oops, looks like we didn't plan a seat for you, Olivia said lightly, as if she were pointing out a missing napkin instead of the empty space where Margaret Hayes was supposed to sit. The words hovered in the warm June air of the backyard in Fairfield, Connecticut, drifting between the pastel balloons and the folding tables lined with blue paper plates. Margaret stood still for just a moment, her gloved hands resting on the silver wrapping of the large Lego set she had chosen for Ethan after driving 20 miles to the specialty toy store because she remembered him mentioning it 3 months ago. Around her, 8 chairs circled the main table. 8 chairs for 8 guests. Daniel at the head, Olivia beside him, Olivia's parents across from them, 2 neighborhood friends, a cousin, and Ethan, glowing in a superhero t-shirt, unaware of the quiet arithmetic that had just erased his grandmother from the count. Margaret adjusted the strap of her handbag and let a small smile settle on her face, the kind that did not quite reach her pale blue eyes. "That's all right," she said evenly. "I won't be long." The backyard was trimmed and immaculate, the lawn cut to exactly 2 inches, the hedges squared with almost military precision. Olivia had planned every detail, from the custom bakery cake to the matching napkins embossed with Ethan's name in metallic ink. Margaret had mailed a check for $500 2 weeks earlier to help with expenses, a gesture Olivia had accepted with a gracious text and a heart emoji. Now Margaret found herself standing beside the drink station, balancing her purse and the gift while conversations swirled past her like she was part of the landscaping. Daniel avoided looking directly at her. He laughed too loudly at something Olivia's father said. He reached for a soda, then another, his eyes scanning everywhere except his mother's face. Margaret noticed these things the way she noticed the weather shifting before a storm. Subtle, predictable, inevitable. She had learned over 72 years that humiliation rarely arrived with shouting. It came quietly, in missing chairs, in small exclusions that could be dismissed as oversight. She set the gift carefully near the cake table and smoothed the wrapping paper once, twice, as if straightening it might restore order. A breeze lifted the corner of a tablecloth, revealing the neat row of place. Cards taped beneath the edge. Margaret scanned them without moving her head. Daniel, Olivia, Carol, Frank, Melissa, Tom, Ethan, Claire. No Margaret. She did not sigh. She did not ask again. Instead, she folded her hands and watched as candles were lit and the children gathered. Ethan waved at her from across the yard, and she waved back, her smile steady, composed, almost serene. To anyone else, it might have looked like grace. Only Margaret knew it was something colder settling into place, something measured and patient. Because this was not the first time a chair had gone missing, and she was beginning to understand that when a seat disappears at your own family's table, it is never an accident. Margaret remained near the edge of the yard while the children gathered around the long table, their voices rising in uneven waves of excitement as Olivia instructed them where to stand for photographs. Daniel lifted his phone and angled it carefully, making sure the banner with Ethan's name was centered behind the cake. Margaret noticed how Olivia gently repositioned Ethan so that her own parents were directly on either side of him, creating a symmetrical frame. Margaret stood several feet back on the trimmed grass, the sunlight catching the silver in her neatly styled hair. No one asked her to step forward. No one shifted to make space. When the candles were lit, 8 small flames flickered against the blue frosting. 8 voices began singing. Margaret joined softly from where she stood, her tone steady and controlled, careful not to draw attention. The song ended in cheers. Ethan leaned forward and blew out the candles in one breath, and the adults clapped as if it were an Olympic achievement. Olivia's mother handed Ethan a napkin. Olivia's father sliced the cake. Daniel laughed again, too loudly, at something that did not require laughter. Margaret folded her hands in front of her and observed. She observed the way Daniel's shoulders tightened whenever their eyes almost met. She observed how Olivia kept moving, always in motion, as if activity itself could disguise intention. A paper plate was eventually handed to Margaret without eye contact, the slice smaller than the others, the frosting already smudged. She thanked the neighbor who passed it to her, though the neighbor looked slightly confused, as if only just noticing that Margaret had been standing the entire time. Margaret tasted the cake. It was overly sweet, the kind made to impress rather than to savor. As she ate, fragments of conversation drifted toward her. Someone mentioned the upcoming move to North Carolina, saying it would be a fresh start. Someone else asked whether the house had already gone under contract. Margaret had not been told there was a contract. She had, however, written a check 3 years earlier for $40,000 to help with the down payment on that very home. She remembered Daniel's voice back then, earnest and grateful, promising they would never forget her generosity. The memory arrived without emotion, like a document being pulled from a filing cabinet. Margaret set her half-finished plate on the edge of the buffet table and walked toward the gift pile. She knelt slowly, mindful of her knees, and watched as Ethan tore open wrapping paper with delighted impatience. When he reached her gift, his eyes widened. He ran to her immediately, arms thrown around her waist. For a brief second, Margaret allowed herself to close her eyes. The hug was sincere. Children had not yet learned the choreography of exclusion. Olivia called Ethan back for another photograph. He went willingly. Margaret straightened and stepped back once more, returning to the perimeter of her own family. She noticed then that an extra folding chair leaned against the garage wall, and used. It had been there the entire time. Close enough to see, far enough not to count. Margaret looked at it for several seconds before turning away. She did not mention it. She did not need to. Something quiet and deliberate was forming in her mind, the way frost forms overnight on grass that had seemed warm only hours before. She understood now that the missing seat was not about space. It was about position. And positions, unlike chairs, could be reassigned. Margaret left the party just after 3:30 in the afternoon, offering a polite goodbye that sounded complete and satisfied to anyone who was not listening closely. The drive back to her condominium took 25 minutes along roads she had known for decades, tree-lined streets where every mailbox and white picket fence felt familiar. She kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, her posture upright, her expression neutral. She did not turn on the radio. Silence allowed her thoughts to arrange themselves without interruption. By the time she pulled into her assigned parking space, the early summer sun had shifted west, casting long shadows across the pavement. Inside her home, the air felt cooler, calmer. She placed her handbag carefully on the kitchen counter and removed her low heels, setting them side by side as she always did. Order mattered to her. It always had. She poured herself a glass of water, filled with exactly 3 ice cubes, and sat at the small oak table near the window. From there she could see the pond behind the building, its surface smooth and undisturbed. She replayed the afternoon in precise detail, not to relive the sting, but to catalog it. 8 chairs. The extra one by the garage. The mention of North Carolina. The word contract. Margaret rose and walked to the hallway closet where she kept a slim fireproof box on the top shelf. She retrieved it without hesitation and carried it back to the table. Inside were neatly labeled folders, each dated in her careful handwriting. She selected the one marked March 3 years earlier. The check carbon copy was still there, attached to a short written agreement Daniel had signed at her suggestion. It had not seemed necessary at the time, but Margaret believed in documentation the way some people believed in luck. The agreement stated that the $40,000 was a loan, interest-free, to be repaid upon sale of the property or within 5 years, whichever came first. She glanced at the calendar on the wall. For years had passed. She traced the signature with her fingertip, remembering Daniel's gratitude, the way he had called her generous, supportive, irreplaceable. Margaret did not feel anger as she studied the paper. She felt clarity. If the house was under contract, then repayment would soon be due. If repayment was due, then conversation was inevitable. She returned the folder to the box, but kept the agreement on the table. The evening light shifted again, casting a pale gold across the kitchen floor. Margaret prepared herself a simple dinner, grilled chicken and steamed green beans, measuring portions with the same care she used in everything else. Routine steadied her breathing. After washing the dishes, she sat down once more and picked up her landline telephone. She did not call Daniel. Not yet. Instead, she dialed the number of an old family attorney who had once handled her late husband's estate. The receptionist recognized her name. The appointment was set for Tuesday at 10 in the morning. Margaret thanked her and hung up. Outside, a breeze rippled the pond's surface for the first time that day, disturbing the reflection of the trees. Margaret watched the water shift and then settle again. She understood something now that she had not fully accepted before. Being excluded from a table was symbolic. Being excluded from information was strategic. And strategy, unlike sentiment, required response. She folded the agreement neatly and placed it beside her planner. Tomorrow she would water her plants, attend her book club, and smile as usual. But beneath the calm surface of her routine, something deliberate had begun to move. Tuesday morning arrived with a sky the color of pale steel, low clouds stretching across Fairfield as Margaret parked her sedan in front of the red brick office building on Main Street. She stepped out carefully, smoothing the front of her navy blazer, and checked her reflection in the car window before locking the door. At 10 o'clock sharp, she sat across from Mr. Howard Bennett, the attorney who had once guided her through the paperwork after her husband passed away. His hair had thinned over the years, but his voice remained steady and measured. Margaret placed the loan agreement on his desk without commentary. He read it once, then again more slowly, adjusting his glasses. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. When he finished, he leaned back slightly and nodded. The document was clear. The condition regarding repayment upon sale of the property was enforceable. If the house was under contract, the funds would be due at closing. Margaret listened without interruption, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not ask whether she should pursue legal action. She asked only what steps were necessary to protect her position. Mr. Bennett explained that a formal notice could be drafted, a courteous reminder of the agreement, requesting confirmation of any pending sale. It would not be aggressive. It would be factual. Margaret approved. By 11:15 she was back in her car with a copy of the drafted letter placed carefully inside her leather folder. The drive home felt different from the one 3 days earlier. Not lighter, not heavier. Simply defined. That afternoon, she attended her regular book club at the community center. The discussion centered on a novel about reinvention later in life. Margaret contributed thoughtfully, her voice calm, her posture composed. No one in the circle would have guessed that a quiet recalibration was unfolding beneath her polite observations about plot and character. After returning home, she brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window overlooking the pond. At precisely 4:30, her telephone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the caller identification screen. Margaret allowed it to ring twice before answering. His tone was casual, almost rehearsed. He mentioned that they had received an inquiry about the house and were considering options. He spoke in generalities, careful not to offer specifics. Margaret responded with equal composure. She told him she was glad to hear the market was strong. She did not mention the letter yet. She did not need to. There was a brief pause on the line, the kind that stretches when both people sense more beneath the surface. Daniel cleared his throat and asked whether she had enjoyed the party. Margaret replied that Ethan had seemed happy. She did not comment on the seating arrangement. Silence followed again, thicker this time. When the call ended, Margaret placed the receiver back in its cradle and looked out at the pond. The water reflected the gray sky, smooth and unbroken. She thought about the extra chair leaning against the garage, about contracts and obligations, about how easily gratitude could fade when convenience replaced memory. Margaret rose, walked to her desk, and placed Mr. Bennett's letter in an envelope addressed neatly in her own handwriting. She would mail it in the morning. She felt no triumph, no bitterness, only balance being restored. In her world, commitments were not decorative. They were structural, and structures, when neglected, eventually demanded reinforcement. Margaret mailed the letter at 9:15 on Wednesday morning, sliding the envelope through the narrow blue slot at the post office with the same calm precision she applied to every task. She watched it disappear, knowing that within a day or two it would land in Daniel's mailbox alongside grocery coupons and utility bills. The action felt neither dramatic nor secretive. It felt necessary. By Thursday afternoon, her telephone rang again. This time there was no pause before she answered. Daniel's voice carried a tightness that had not been there before. He said they had received a formal notice from Mr. Bennett regarding the loan. He asked why she had involved an attorney instead of speaking to him directly. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she explained in an even tone that the agreement had been clear from the beginning and that the letter was simply a reminder of its terms. She mentioned that she had heard the house might be under contract and wanted to ensure everything was handled properly. Daniel hesitated, then admitted that they had accepted an offer the previous week and were scheduled to close in 6 weeks. Margaret absorbed the timeline quietly. 6 weeks. She thanked him for confirming and stated that repayment at closing would resolve the matter completely. There was a sound in the background, perhaps Olivia speaking from another room. Daniel lowered his voice and said that Olivia felt blindsided. Margaret responded that contracts do not rely on feelings. They rely on signatures. The line grew silent again, heavy but controlled. Daniel finally said they would review their finances and call her back. After the conversation ended, Margaret set the receiver down gently and returned to watering her indoor plants, allowing the rhythm of pouring and draining to steady her breathing. Later that evening, her mobile phone vibrated with a text message from Olivia. The message was polite on the surface but edged with accusation. Olivia wrote that family matters should stay within the family and that legal letters created unnecessary tension. Margaret read the message twice before replying. She wrote that clarity prevents tension and that repayment would allow everyone to move forward without misunderstanding. She added a simple sentence wishing them a smooth closing process. She did not include an emoji. The following Sunday, Daniel and Olivia stopped by unannounced in the late afternoon. Margaret opened the door wearing a light gray cardigan and invited them in without surprise. They sat at her oak table, the same one where the agreement had rested days earlier. Daniel spoke first, explaining that the sale proceeds were already allocated toward the purchase of a larger home in North Carolina. He suggested that perhaps repayment could be delayed until after they settled there. Margaret folded her hands and looked at him steadily. She reminded him that the agreement specified repayment upon sale, not relocation. Olivia interjected, saying that circumstances change and that Margaret surely understood the challenges of young families. Margaret acknowledged that she did understand challenges, which was precisely why she had provided the loan in the first place. She then asked whether they had planned for repayment when they listed the house. Neither answered immediately. The silence stretched across the table, deliberate and revealing. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not lean forward. She simply stated that she expected the full amount at closing, as agreed, and that honoring commitments strengthens families rather than weakens them. Daniel nodded slowly, the weight of accountability settling across his shoulders. Olivia's expression tightened, but she said nothing further. When they left, the front door closed with a soft click. Margaret stood in the quiet foyer for a moment, listening to the fading sound of their car pulling away. Outside, the evening sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn. Inside, Margaret felt something shift, not in anger but in alignment. The balance was not yet restored, but it was moving steadily in that direction. The following week unfolded with a quiet tension that hovered just beneath the surface of ordinary routines. Margaret continued her mornings as usual, waking at 6:30, making her bed with crisp hospital corners, and walking 1 mile around the pond behind her condominium complex. Neighbors waved. She waved back. Nothing in her posture suggested conflict. Yet she sensed movement elsewhere, like distant thunder that had not yet reached her street. On Friday afternoon, Mr. Bennett called to inform her that he had received confirmation from the buyer's attorney. The closing date was officially scheduled for July 22nd at 10 in the morning. The sale price was higher than expected, leaving a comfortable margin even after mortgage payoff. Margaret thanked him and asked that he send written notice to the closing attorney to ensure her loan repayment would be disbursed directly from escrow. It was a procedural step, clean and impersonal. Later that evening, Daniel called again. His voice carried less defensiveness and more calculation. He explained that they had reviewed their finances and were concerned about the impact of repaying the full $40,000 at closing. He spoke about moving expenses, about school enrollment fees in North Carolina, about furniture deposits. Margaret listened without interruption, seated at her oak table with her planner open beside her. When he finished, she asked one simple question. Had they budgeted for repayment when they listed the house? Daniel paused. He admitted that they had hoped to discuss it later. Margaret responded that later had arrived. There was no accusation in her tone, only fact. Daniel shifted to a softer approach, suggesting that perhaps she could consider it a gift, given that she would benefit indirectly from their improved circumstances. Margaret allowed a brief silence to settle before answering. She reminded him that generosity had already been extended in the form of an interest-free loan, and that honoring agreements was what allowed trust to remain intact. She added that financial independence on all sides prevented future misunderstandings. The phrase landed firmly. Daniel did not argue further. After the call ended, Margaret stood by her window and watched as a light rain began to fall across the pond, dimpling its surface in small, precise circles. She did not feel triumphant. She felt steady. On Sunday afternoon, Ethan called her from his tablet, his face bright on the screen. He spoke excitedly about packing boxes and choosing paint colors for his new room. Margaret smiled warmly and asked about his favorite shade of blue. She did not mention contracts or closings. Children deserved uncomplicated conversations. When the call ended, she sat quietly for a few moments, absorbing the contrast between innocence and negotiation. The following Tuesday, Olivia sent a brief message confirming that the closing attorney had acknowledged the repayment arrangement. The tone was formal, stripped of earlier tension. Margaret replied with equal brevity, thanking her for the update and wishing them a smooth transition. Outside, the clouds began to thin, allowing late afternoon sunlight to filter through the trees. Margaret returned to her routine, watering her plants and organizing her desk, but beneath the measured calm of her movements was a deeper understanding. Respect is often revealed not in celebrations, but in settlements. And settlements, once documented, have a way of clarifying every unspoken hierarchy at the table. July 22nd arrived warm and bright, the kind of morning that made Fairfield look polished and prosperous. Margaret dressed carefully in a light beige suit and low heels, her silver hair set neatly away from her face. She was not required to attend the closing in person, but she chose to drive to Mr. Bennett's office anyway, preferring proximity to uncertainty. At 10:12 in the morning, his assistant stepped into the waiting area with a composed smile and confirmed that the documents had been signed. The escrow officer had disbursed funds accordingly. A cashier's check in the amount of $40,000 was being prepared for transfer to Margaret's account. There was no applause, no dramatic declaration. Only signatures on paper and numbers shifting from one column to another. Margaret inclined her head in acknowledgement and thanked the staff before stepping outside into the sunlight. She did not rush to the bank. She walked half a block to a small cafe instead and ordered a cup of black coffee, taking a seat near the window. She watched people pass by, briefcases in hand, summer dresses swaying in the light breeze. Life continued at its usual pace. Her phone vibrated on the table. Daniel's name appeared again. She answered calmly. His voice carried fatigue, as if the morning had drained him more than he expected. He confirmed that the sale had closed and that the repayment had been processed. There was a pause. Then he said he hoped this would put everything behind them. Margaret replied that honoring commitments tends to clear the air. She did not add more. Daniel hesitated before asking whether she would consider visiting them in North Carolina once they were settled. Margaret said she would see how the autumn looked on her calendar. The conversation ended without tension, but without warmth. Later that afternoon, the funds appeared in her account, precise and complete. Margaret reviewed the transaction once, then closed her laptop. She did not celebrate. Instead, she took out a leather-bound notebook and made a simple entry recording the repayment date. Order restored. That evening, Olivia sent a brief message thanking her for her understanding during the process. The tone was carefully neutral, almost corporate. Margaret responded in kind, wishing them success in their new home. She did not mention the party. She did not mention the missing chair. She understood now that respect is rarely negotiated in raised voices. It is negotiated in boundaries. Over the next week, moving trucks lined Daniel's driveway. Margaret did not drive by to observe. She heard updates indirectly through Ethan's cheerful calls about long highway stretches and rest stops. She listened, asked about snacks and favorite songs in the car, and kept her tone bright. Children deserved continuity, not conflict. On the evening, before their departure, Daniel called once more. He thanked her again, this time more quietly, and admitted that the repayment had forced them to adjust their budget, but had also clarified priorities. Margaret responded that clarity can be uncomfortable but useful. After she hung up, she stood by her window as the sun lowered over the pond, casting long golden streaks across the water. The surface remained calm, reflecting the sky without distortion. Margaret realized that something fundamental had shifted. She had not raised her voice. She had not issued threats. She had simply insisted on balance. And in doing so, she had reclaimed more than money. She had reclaimed position. Autumn arrived slowly in Connecticut, painting the trees around the pond in shades of amber and rust while Margaret adjusted to the quiet rhythm of her days without the undercurrent of financial uncertainty. The repayment had settled into her account weeks earlier, and she had already redirected a portion into a conservative investment fund, another portion into a college savings account for Ethan that she controlled independently. She did not announce this decision to Daniel or Olivia. She simply completed the paperwork and filed the confirmation in her fireproof box. In North Carolina, the move appeared to be progressing. Photographs surfaced on social media of a larger house with white siding and a broad front porch. Margaret observed them without comment. She noted the carefully staged images, the captions about fresh beginnings and family growth. There was no reference to the sale that had made it possible, no acknowledgement of the settlement that had adjusted their plans. She did not expect one. One evening in late October, Ethan called to show her the maple tree in their new yard. He turned the camera clumsily, capturing bright red leaves against a clear blue sky. Margaret admired it sincerely and asked whether he had chosen his new desk for school. His enthusiasm filled the screen. After the call ended, she sat quietly, reflecting on how children measure belonging differently than adults. Weeks later, Daniel phoned again, his tone less guarded than before. He spoke about the challenges of settling into a new community and admitted that budgeting had been tighter than anticipated. Margaret listened, offering measured encouragement but no financial suggestions. She had learned that assistance without boundaries breeds expectation rather than gratitude. Daniel mentioned that Olivia had found part-time work and that they were adjusting. There was a subtle shift in his voice, a humility that had not been present earlier in the summer. Margaret recognized it, but did not highlight it. Instead, she spoke about the turning leaves in Connecticut and the first frost expected soon. The conversation remained civil, even calm. Afterward, Margaret reviewed her own plans. She scheduled a winter trip with friends, something she had postponed for years while prioritizing others. She met with her financial advisor to update her estate documents, ensuring clarity in every allocation. The experience had sharpened her understanding of how quickly roles can be redefined when boundaries blur. By early November, a small package arrived from North Carolina. Inside was a framed photograph of Ethan standing in front of his new home, holding a handwritten card that read, "Thank you, Grandma." The handwriting was uneven but earnest. Margaret studied the image carefully, noting the porch railing, the clean driveway, the absence of folding chairs or misplaced details. She placed the frame on her mantel beside older family photographs. She did not interpret the gesture as apology. She interpreted it as continuity. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the tree-line and the pond reflected a deep violet sky, Margaret understood that the season had turned in more ways than one. The balance she had insisted upon had not fractured the family. It had recalibrated it. And in that recalibration, she had quietly ensured that if she were ever invited to another table, her place would not depend on courtesy. It would depend on clarity. Winter settled gently over Connecticut, frosting the edges of the pond behind Margaret's condominium and thinning the daylight to a pale silver glow by late afternoon. Nearly a year had passed since that summer afternoon when something small and deliberate had shifted the balance of her family. The seasons had turned without drama, as they always did, and Margaret had allowed time to do what time does best. In early June, a familiar invitation arrived in her mailbox. This one printed on thick cardstock with bright blue lettering announcing Ethan's 9th birthday celebration in North Carolina. The envelope was addressed in Daniel's handwriting, careful and unmistakable. Margaret studied it for a moment before opening it at her oak table. The details were clear. There would be a backyard gathering at their new home, Saturday. At 2 o'clock, cake and games to follow. At the bottom, in a separate line, Daniel had written that they hoped she would come and stay the weekend. Margaret did not respond immediately. She reviewed her calendar, confirmed her travel plans, and booked a round-trip flight for Friday morning. She arrived to warm southern air and a wide porch lined with rocking chairs. Olivia greeted her with a polite smile, measured but respectful. Daniel carried her suitcase inside without being asked. The house was spacious, sunlight pouring through tall windows. On Saturday afternoon, guests began to arrive. Folding tables were arranged neatly across the lawn. Balloons were tied to the porch railing. Margaret walked slowly toward the main table, observing without comment. There were place cards again, small and intentional. She counted them quietly. One for Daniel, one for Olivia, one for each set of grandparents visiting, one for Ethan, one for her. The card read Margaret in simple blue ink. A chair waited directly beside Ethan's. No one mentioned it. No one explained it. They did not need to. Margaret took her seat when the time came, smoothing her skirt as she settled in. She did not search for extra chairs by the garage. She did not stand at the edge of the yard. When the cake was carried out, Ethan reached for her hand before blowing out his candles. Cameras flashed. Olivia stepped aside to make room in the photograph without being prompted. Margaret's smile was steady, neither triumphant nor forgiving, simply present. Later that evening, as the guests drifted home and the sky turned soft pink over the Carolina trees, Margaret sat alone for a moment on the porch rocker. She listened to the quiet hum of cicadas and considered the arc of the past year. She had not demanded affection. She had not raised her voice. She had drawn a boundary and held it. Respect had followed, not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. Inside the house, laughter rose from the kitchen where Daniel and Olivia cleared plates together. Margaret understood something now with clarity that did not require bitterness. A seat at the table is never about wood and metal. It is about position. And when position is defined by principle rather than permission, it does not disappear again.